Blitz, no one should be better off than anyone else, that equality should be a principle, that sacrifice should be shared. I think his view of a socialist England, though he didn't like warfare and scarcity, and of course those are the awful features of the 1984 society, poverty and warfare coercion, he liked the natural equality of the people in London during the Blitz. And probably that was another of his images of how people could live in a more fraternal manner. He was just one of nature's egalitarians.
Do you buy that?
Well, in the sense that he was ultimately a socialist and not a progressive. And those two words are usually conflated nowadays. That is, he was a socialist in his championing of the common man and egalitarianism. But he had no doctrine of progress. He had no interest in evolutionary theories that lead to progress. One reason why the New Left was rather hostile to him. The kind of theoretical, Europeanized attitude about socialism that meant that it was an ideology of progress was one very foreign to Orwell's view.
And if I may, I mentioned the three things I thought he got right of the 20th century. The fourth great feature of the 20th century, apart from the battles between and about totalitarianism and empire, is the rise of the United States as the exemplary or the most important society, and that's where Orwell does fail. He never showed any real interest in the United States. He never wanted to come here, often refused invitations to come, even from his friends at Partisan Review and among writers like Mary McCarthy and Philip Rove and Dwight MacDonald, with whom he had friendships, and seemed to sort of withhold himself from the whole idea of this new world. What he does write about America is quite interesting, and it's not bad, but it's the great subject he refused. And in my book I say it's his great failure. He didn't shake off all his old middle-class English prejudices, and one of the ones he failed to shake was the view that America was really a bit on the, a bit cheap and a bit nasty.
Let's now move gently and tenderly into this wonderful argument about what Orwell would have been had he lived. He died at, what, age 46 or something?
Age 46.
Age 46. Christopher, you participated in a very interesting colloquium with Norman Podhoretz, what, 1980 was it?
It was 84, in fact.
Oh, it was 1984.
I'm sure it was the anniversary
where Podhoretz
or
said...
potential anniversary, moral anniversary.
Right. Podhoretz claims Orwell's patrimony for the neoconservatives and said it's very clear that had he lived, he would be with us on the Committee for the Present Danger and with our views, and you do a rebuttal, a stinging rebuttal.
Thank you.
And then he does a stinging re-rebuttal of saying...
if you say so.
Well, are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Instead of having Christopher describe it, why don't you describe it, and then we'll...
He splits the difference in his book. But actually, we could do, if I may, I could propose a simpler matter. Dr. Rodden said a few moments ago, we don't know what Orwell would have said about McCarthyism or about the Vietnam War. I disagree, because he'd actually pronounced on both of them before he died. There was a proposal for a witch hunt in Britain in the 1940s, for a cleansing of the civil service of subversives, and he wrote and publicized and campaigned for a principle that said there should be no tribunals, no secret evidence, no arraignments of people for their political views if they're working for the government. If people are suspected of actual treason, these are the safeguards they should have before any hearing.
Yeah, but he was also
very opposed
accused,
to the witch hunt mentality.
But he was...
And no one was more anti-communist than him, nobody.
Yeah.
And he'd been a victim himself of communists in the civil service,
right, but
who tried to prevent him from being published.
He was also accused by the left during the war of, quotes, naming names of people, which was the same phrase that the McCarthyites
yes.
were attacked for.
But the names on that list are the names of people who he'd attacked in print as willing servants of Joseph Stalin. He never said anything surreptitiously that he hadn't said openly in print.
Well, Podhoretz did claim that if Orwell were alive today, he'd be standing with the neoconservatives and against the left. And the question arises, to what extent can you even begin to predict the political positions of somebody who's been dead 3 decades and more by that time? There are various ways of attempting to plot out what Orwell would have thought had he lived. For instance, what did his friends, those who were close to him, think? Well, as a matter of fact, his literary executor, Richard Rees, was a staunch conservative and religious believer. Also, another close friend, Malcolm Muggeridge, eventually turned and became a believer in the church. Others, such as Christopher Hollis, who went to school with him, wrote the first substantive study of Orwell's work. Right there you have three conservatives of different stripes.
He's close to Arthur Koestler, who was also an arch anti-communist and no
Very much so.
No
and in that case, a
Democrat,
different political trajectory, since Koestler, eventually by the mid-late 50s, decided to disavow himself of political activity altogether. So if you want to look at Orwell's contemporaries and see which way they went and try to plot how he might have responded to political events, you go all over the place. And there's no real clue.
Except that he's already said before he dies what his views are on these matters.
If you believe that those matters are continuous beyond his death.
No one is more anti-communist than Orwell.
Everyone agrees on that. Okay.
So I'm afraid your Koestler and other points I don't think weigh very much. It's possible he might have repudiated politics completely and become despairing. That's likely, even. I think it's incredibly unlikely he would have become religious. He had a very settled view against the religious mentality. But on the crucial questions that make up neoconservatism, which was his prediction that he would have been at least understanding of McCarthyism, at least sympathetic to the Vietnam War, and, by the way, another ingredient in neoconservatism, that he would have been friendly to Zionism. Orwell had written firmly on all 3 points while he was still alive and compos mentis. He was against McCarthyism, against witch hunting of communists. He was against the restoration of European colonialism in Asia, which means the American succession of the war in Indochina for the French is condemned avant la lettre. And he always thought, and even his Jewish friends at Tribune remember it, he said, you know, now we wish we'd listened. He always said this will lead to a military state in Palestine.
Well, take Vietnam. Richard Reeves, his best friend and literary executor, wrote during the Vietnam War, if Orwell were alive today, I am certain he would be for the Americans. Then, from the left, Mary McCarthy wrote an essay in the New York Review of Books where she said the same thing.
Well,
and I once had a debate with her about this very point. I knew more about what he thought about Indochina than she did.
Yeah, but I know, because I worked for President Johnson during the Vietnam War for a few years, maybe I know a little more about what that war was about in terms of the way America saw it. It was not a war reestablishing European imperialism. For good or for ill, it was an American attempt to stop a tide of international communist-backed governments, of which North Vietnam was one. So to say that he was anti-imperialist and therefore he would have been anti-American in Vietnam, whether you agree with what America did or not, it certainly didn't turn out right. That was not what America was doing.
He understood the excuse for empire would be anti-communism. One of the reasons why I think he was inadequate as a writer about the United States, and he never quite saw how interesting and important a subject it was that he was suspicious of its imperial designs, its global and megalo intentions. I think there's good evidence, if we're simply asking ourselves what he might have thought, I think the record is clear long before he dies that he would have had no truck with anything as ghastly or irrational or stupid as the American intervention.
Orwell was an anti-intellectual at a time when intellectualism was almost wholly dominated by the left. I mean, there's that famous quote, how does it go?
No common man could believe such a thing. You'd have to be an intellectual to fall for anything as stupid as that.
Right, okay. He writes not in these exact words, but what later came to be called the blame America first or blame Britain first. He condemns that. He attacks the language principally of the left, although of both. He attacks the idea of moral equivalence, which was really the keystone of neoconservatism in the recent era. He is very pro-family, and he is vigorously anti-crime. Now, so there's I'm just laying out, because you heard Christopher's view, that would sort of be some of the building blocks of the neocons' view of that, and I wonder how you would deal with his and my view on this. We'd make you the arbiter here.
Well, Orwell undeniably had what someone once referred to as a Tory growl.
Connor Cruise O'Brien.
Connor Cruise O'Brien. There are undeniable conservative features in the Orwell physiognomy, some of which you've just mentioned. So to some extent, Orwell facilitated the kinds of uses and abuses by the right that his name has been put to. In other words,